Hi, this is Ryan Buckner with Schellman. In today's installment of the Truth Series, we're going to build upon an earlier conversation that we'd had with one of our subject matter experts in the financial cybersecurity assessment space. We're going to speak specifically about SWIFT, S-W-I-F-T. And to help us get to the truth of the matter, I'm joined once again with a very special friend and colleague, John Anderson.
Thanks, Buck.
John, thanks so much for joining back with me. And I had a few more questions. I had a chance to go back and look at my notes on what we talked about in a prior installment. And you mentioned SWIFT amongst the sort of all the array of cybersecurity assessments that are out there. I wanted to focus in on that one because I thought it had a really interesting name.
Yeah.
But I imagine, like most things in the compliance space, the name actually means something else. In this case, probably 5 other words. What is SWIFT? What does it stand for?
Well, yeah, so SWIFT stands for the Society for Worldwide Interfinancial Transfers.
Okay, one more time.
Society for Worldwide Interfinancial Transfers.
Okay, got it. It's somehow I definitely prefer SWIFT, and I understand why they went with SWIFT.
Well, the French pronunciation, so it is it's much more beautiful, right?
I see.
It's much better. But
excellent. So, what is SWIFT?
yeah, so that's a great question. So, SWIFT was kind of founded, in the 70s, around the 70s, to kind of facilitate bank-to-bank communication for financial messages, right?
Okay,
and
interesting.
That's across international borders, really.
Okay.
And so what kind of was happening here once the information age kind of began to get spun up in the 70s, right, is these banks really needed a standard way to communicate about what money is moving where, who's paying whom and how much, who is debiting whose account, who's crediting whose account.
Got it.
And so SWIFT kind of was, founded or put together. It's really a consortium of all those banks that came together, and they founded SWIFT.
Okay.
Right? It's not much different than how PCI was kind of founded by the payment brands, right? They came together. Let's do this thing because, gosh, this is out of control.
That's
and
right.
So SWIFT, for a long time, only handled the standardization of the messaging, right? Let's make sure that all the banks are talking the same language.
Is it an oversimplification to refer to it as a protocol, or is that essentially what it was?
So it kind of was a protocol back then and a network, and there's also software. So now I would say, the modern era, it is a network and it is software.
Got it.
And it is kind of a protocol. You could definitely say that, but it's an organization too.
That's right.
And so what happened in 2014? So I'll take you back in the time machine to 2014, a long time ago.
That's right.
There was a SWIFT bank, and we won't name names, but it can be Googled. They had a breach, right? And so that affected the whole SWIFT network because money was transferred and moved in and out of the SWIFT network from this bank who had their security controls breached. There was nothing wrong with SWIFT's security controls, but as you know, there's sometimes a reliance there, especially when we have those connections going in and out of the network, right? And so what happened was SWIFT decided, kind of after that was all said and done, they determined the root cause and done their investigation and remediated it. It was time to put security controls out to the member organizations, the banks, if you will, these organizations that are SWIFT users.
Got it.
And I say SWIFT users because we're not talking about individuals, we're talking about entities that use the SWIFT software and the SWIFT network.
I see. Got it. So help me understand, who is this for exactly, right? So when you consider SWIFT, obviously, there are going to be these member institutions that you mentioned a moment ago, and you're going to have this consortium, if you would, this body of financial institutions that are essentially sounds like they're responsible for SWIFT. But when you consider a SWIFT assessment, what are the types of individuals that are, or excuse me, the types of entities that are using SWIFT assessments?
Yeah, great question. And so when we say SWIFT assessment, I think the context that we're going to talk about here is going to be the SWIFT Cybersecurity Controls Framework Assessment.
Sure.
Another big mouthful. So you can just say CSCF if you like.
Okay.
It's part of the SWIFT Customer Security program that we just talked about that came out of that breach of that member institution. So who it's for is any user of the SWIFT network. And when we say user, obviously we're not talking about individuals. We mean an organization, right? So anyone who is putting messages on and off the line generally is going to have to conduct an independent assessment against their compliance for the CSCF.
CSCF, independent. So my mind is already thinking of who can do this.
Yeah.
And as soon as you say independent, I'm thinking this can't be a self-assessment, or is that not the case?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it used to be a self-assessment, right? So from 2014 to around 2018, 2019, it was a self-assessment. So
Interesting.
the entities could go out to a portal and they could self-attest. And they had been doing that. And so what Swift decided was, in order to kind of standardize and give everyone some assurance, right, that these attestations on the KYCSA portal, right, that's the portal that all counterparties are able to see other counterparties' attestations publicly. Yeah. So Swift wanted to make sure that they were accurate, right, and some more reliance could be placed on those attestations.
And what's the name of that portal again?
The Know Your Customer Security Attestation, KYCSA.
Interesting, interesting. That reminds me of sort of the way the FedRent marketplace works. There's a public registry, ISO certifications, again, public registry, CSA star. These things are publicly available. It's nice to see, it's reassuring to see that the same thing persists in the financial cybersecurity market as well.
Yeah, it's very interesting. So now you have to be independently verified. Your attestation has to be independently verified, and what that means is the assessor, whoever that is, the independent assessor, can be an external assessor or can be a validated independent internal assessor.
Interesting.
Right? Which is going to be a challenge for some organizations, right?
That's right.
To have that independence internally. But they will come in and they will validate the attestation by actually going through all the controls, looking at evidence, conducting interviews. Not an audit.
That's right.
But a very intense assessment.
That's right, exactly. It seems like you're interviewing personnel, you're interviewing the various stakeholders, you're looking at artifacts, you're determining sufficiency of the evidence.
Yes.
It sounds like an audit, right? But it sounds as though that it's truly an in-depth assessment.
It is.
To make sure that the organization or the entity, the member, if you would, is actually meeting the spirit of the control and determining the efficacy of their implementation.
Yeah.
In some earlier conversations that we had, I know that we were having conversations about maturity. When you consider a SWIFT assessment, is there a maturity component to it as well, to where maybe you do well in the assessment in year one, but maybe you don't do so well, but it's comparative to subsequent years? Or is it the SWIFT assessment, you really need to nail it in that first year?
Yeah, that's a great question. So what Swift kind of has allowed in the customer security program and the CSCF is the attestation window opens every year from July to December, right? So
That's interesting.
So you can conduct your assessment before July if you wish, but as you know, if we say the assessor conducted in February, between February and July, that's a long period of time. Right?
That's right.
So those things get stale. We don't know if we can place reliance on that. So
that's right.
Between that time period, they can go and attest.
Okay.
They can attest as I do not comply, but I will comply by. Right?
Interesting.
And so after December and up through the next July, that is your remediation time period. So you can go and remediate the findings that your assessor found. Then you come back and update your attestation, right? And then the assessor would come back in July and reassess.
So it's almost like there's a continuous monitoring or component to this, to where, you can do great in the first half of the year and maybe not so great in the second half of the year, but you have to put in those, remediation plans and corrective action plans and get those things done.
You do.
Absolutely. So what about, you were mentioning the assessor, and you had mentioned previously, I guess from about maybe a period of 5 years or so, 2014, 2018, so forth, so on and so forth, it was some things that can be done internally. Now, they can still be done internally, but there needs to be this validated independence of the assessor prior to that occurring.
Yeah.
How does one, if you're not looking internally, if you're wanting to look externally, who are the validated assessors, so to speak?
Yeah, great question. So Swift doesn't necessarily validate assessors, but they do list assessors that are kind of participants in the Swift program. They list those out on their website. So if you go to swift.com, there's a whole listing of assessors across the globe.
That's a huge help, because if I were listening in and I was an organization trying to figure out who do I trust, who should I go to engage to perhaps do one of these assessments, if it can't be done in-house, I would want there to be at least a list to get started of who's at least demonstrated some degree of efficiency, effectiveness, quality in order to go through and perform these types of assessments.
Absolutely.
So that's actually helpful.
Now, Swift does require assessors to undergo training annually. The assessors that are listed on Swift.com, they do require them to undergo training, right?
Excellent.
So they have been not necessarily vetted, but they have been instructed to take that training, and SWIFT does monitor that.
That's right.
That training
so there's at least
done.
a minimum level of subject matter expertise.
Absolutely.
So that you don't have someone in your organization that has no idea, right, on what the criteria or what the subject matter pertains. That's excellent.
Yep, you nailed it.
All right, I've got another question for you. This is going to be a tough one. All right. And the ground rules are you're not allowed to say it depends. All right. SWIFT assessment. How much does it cost?
It depends. Yeah, so that's a really great question. So there are so part of SWIFT is determining what is your SWIFT architecture, right? And so the biggest control burden is at the very top. That's an A or an A1, right? And that's where all of the SWIFT components are owned by the entity under assessment, or they have the license, or they own these components.
What do you mean components? What are we talking about?
Yeah,
here?
so SWIFT has messaging components, right?
Okay.
They have messaging components, and they have components that talk to the SWIFT network.
Got
so
it.
if you own the licenses to those components,
I see.
right,
Okay.
you have a much higher control burden because
right.
Very obviously you either might have those on site, or they could be at a third-party, colo
That's
location that you have some control over.
More you're responsible for, more you need
Yes.
to attest to.
At the bottom end, at the there's 4 to 5 different architecture types. At the bottom end, they don't own anything, right? They send an API call out, or they have a service provider that handles it. So let's talk about pricing then. At the top end, at these A1 and A2s, we can usually, depending on the size of the organization, sorry to throw the depends in, and the amount of components we need to look at, those can usually be done for 2 weeks. Around $29,000 for 2
Got it.
weeks,
Okay.
right?
Okay.
At the very far end, when you come down to a B, we can usually facilitate a B assessment. That's the lowest level of responsibility, right? For about $14,900 for 1 week.
Got it. That's actually helpful because when you look at perhaps something like a PCI assessment or a FedRAMP assessment, particularly with FedRAMP, you can get into the hundreds of thousands of dollars just in consulting fees alone.
Yeah.
And then you have the additional assessment and annual assessments thereafter, similar to ISO, which certainly wouldn't be that high, but there's a component or attitude with ISO to where you have the certification in a particular year and then a couple rounds of surveillance audits before your next recertification.
Yeah.
It sounds as though that the financial cybersecurity assessment, particularly related to SWIFT, is on the lower end of the compliance spectrum. So organizations that have been through, whether it's FedRAMP or ISO or even some pretty healthy SOC reports, this is nothing like that. It's more closer to something that if you properly plan and execute, get the right assessor, it can be done for less than $50K.
Absolutely, and what you just mentioned, those steps of planning, determining what your architecture is, choosing the right assessor, those are mentioned in much of SWIFT's guidance in the independent assessor framework guides that are out there. That's
right.
exactly what they recommend that entities do, those
right.
exact steps.
So many compliance initiatives easily are 6 figures or more. It's sort of refreshing to say that, through SWIFT, there are things that you can do. There's some controls, some guidance, some things that you can follow, and you can still get it done in a relatively, compared to others, cost-effective manner.
Oh yeah, and these controls that SWIFT has kind of outlined or defined, right? There's 7 control areas. They map right on over to NIST CSF, to ISO 27001, and to PCI, if you can believe that. And the beauty is a lot of these controls are enterprise-wide, right?
That's right.
So you do get a lot of bang for your
I was going to say.
buck.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's a great framework if you have to undertake a SWIFT assessment. It's a really good one to undertake. You get a lot of value out of it.
No. Is that a perfectly fine answer? What if an organization just says, I don't want to do it. I don't want to be involved with SWIFT. I don't want to be tied into their network. I don't want to have anything to do with this whatsoever. Right. Is that a reality for a financial institution in the 21st century?
If they want to use the SWIFT network and put financial messages on SWIFT's network and send them, and they have counterparties, I don't think they can say no. Well, they can say no, but what SWIFT does reserve the right to do, if they choose to not attest or their attestation is that we don't comply and we choose not to comply, SWIFT reserves the right to report that institution to their regulators, to their oversight, whoever their oversight is in that country. Right?
Interesting.
So here in the United States, we would be talking about some of those big initials that we talked about a while ago, FDIC, FRB, the OCC.
That's right.
I could keep going with those initials, but
yeah.
I'm running out of initials.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you what, if I'm an organization and I'm considering undergoing SWIFT, I know that in prior conversations we talked about the FFIEC and how they have tools and resources that are publicly available, don't cost a dime. You basically download them, you read through them, and you work with either consultants, assessors, internal personnel to become more familiar with it. Does SWIFT have a similar cadre of guidance out there that where an organization can go and learn more about SWIFT?
Great question, and I appreciate you asking that. Yeah, we recommend to all of our SWIFT clients, and I'm sure all other assessors recommend the same. SWIFT has a website, swift.com. If you're a SWIFT user, you likely have a login. If you don't, you can get one as a SWIFT user. And they have a whole library of everything that's needed to go through a SWIFT CSCF assessment. They also have copies of the CSP. And what's really great about SWIFT is they're always a year ahead.
What do you mean?
Well, in July of this year, they will publish the 2024 framework. The 2023 framework was published last July. So you can stay ahead of the curve,
That's right.
You can stay well ahead of the curve and know what's coming. And not be surprised.
Is early adoption allowed in many cases?
You can. You can early adopt. And then the next year, or when we come back and nothing has changed, you can rely on that assessment if you're an early adopter.
Excellent.
Yeah.
So swift.com not only provides you with the guidance, the various controls, documentation, but I think you mentioned earlier also a list of assessors that have been through the training and are probably the very first place you should go if you're seeking to engage a third party.
Absolutely, I would.
Yeah. Fantastic. Now, I know that there's a Fedline assessment that's out there.
Yes.
So perhaps I could have you back and we can talk Fedline?
Absolutely, I'd love to come back.
Thanks so much, John. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Buck.
Yeah. Well, that'll do it for this installment of the Truth Series, where we strive to provide simple answers to complex questions. Now, in this installment, we talked about a lot of different acronyms and cybersecurity assessments in the financial space. But if you still have questions related to anything you heard today or any other financial cybersecurity assessments, reach out to us on our website.